Ken Bensinger has worked at the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and since 2014 for BuzzFeed News as a member of its investigations team. He's written about sports, labor, art, automobiles, and politics, been the winner of the National Magazine Award and the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Finance and Business Reporting, and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in National Reporting. And the new book that's just out, and it's coincident with the Soccer World Cup that's about to start in Russia, Red Card, How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. It's the first insider account. Welcome, Ken.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
And we're honored we got to have an advance peek at the book. It's actually coming out on June 12th. This show will be airing after that. And it's big stuff in it. First of all, tell people what red card means.
So red card is a term from soccer. So trying to play a small, a gentle play on words there. A red card in the game of soccer is when someone commits a penalty or a foul that's so severe that they have to be ejected from the game. So it's sort of the highest degree of penalty in the sport. There's a similar infraction that's less severe called a yellow card. And that, well, as it sounds like, is a yellow card, and that's a warning, essentially. But if you get a red card as a player, they throw you out. And so because this investigation was of corruption within soccer, and because the people who were finally caught up for having committed criminal acts were, indicted, arrested, and thrown in jail, we thought it was sort of the severest thing that could happen to them, and we thought the name red card, or I thought the name red card was apropos.
I think people will see it's pretty apt by the time we get done. Now, we're on the eve of the World Cup. It's in Russia, and then it's in Qatar, which is 115 degrees and kind of a small Middle East country. How did both Russia and Qatar even get picked?
So typically FIFA would do the voting, and FIFA, by the way, is the international sports organization in charge of all soccer in the world, sort of the top-level organization that oversees every other soccer organization down below it, and which determines where the World Cup is held. And it's FIFA is an acronym, the name. FIFA typically holds a vote every X number of years, I think every 6 or 8 years, to determine where the following World Cup will be held. And in 2010, they had a vote, which was very curious because, unlike every other time in sort of memory, the vote was held for 2 different World Cup cycles simultaneously. That is to say, when they selected the World Cup in 2006, 2002, et cetera, those World Cups were selected individually, but they decided that they were going to vote in December 2010 for the location of both the 2018 and 22 World Cups at the same time. When they announced that, a huge rush of countries came in all wanting their opportunity to host the World Cup, because the feeling was it's this big, very prestigious event. It's an opportunity for a country to showcase itself before the biggest audience in the whole world. The World Cup draws a gigantic television audience, even larger than the Olympics. The passion in most of the world for the sport is huge, and so a lot of countries, the United States included, feel like the chance to hold this event was a prestigious thing that they would really like, and so many countries signed up to host one of these. FIFA, the organization, ultimately decided that they would divide the entrance into those who are based in Europe, and they would compete for the 2018 rights, and those who are the rest of the world, they would compete for 2022. And with that division, you created sort of some front runners in the 2 categories. But in the European group, which was vying for 2018, your clear front runners were England and Russia. There was other bids from a few other places, but those were the 2 people that everyone thought would win. And then separately for 2022, the clear front runner by far was the United States. Australia was in there, and South Korea was in there, and there's a few other countries in there, but it was clear that really the U.S. was the front runner. There was Qatar in the mix, but no one, even took it seriously. Qatar is a country that's tiny. It has an inhospitable climate for hosting a soccer tournament at that time of year. The World Cup is always held in June and July. And in June, July in Qatar, it has daytime temperatures that are barely fit for human consumption. And it has no real soccer history. Qatar has never qualified for a World Cup. I don't think they've ever ranked much higher than about 100th in the world in terms of their their soccer team. And so it really wasn't clear they had anything sort of going for them. And so the assumption was that probably England would win and probably the U.S. would win. England had the most soccer history of any country. England invented the sport. England won the World Cup in 1966, and they have marvelous facilities for the sport, these beautiful stadiums all over the country and excellent infrastructure, and really everything was sort of ready for them to host. And the U.S., of course, hosted the World Cup before. The U.S. also has excellent infrastructure, and from an economic point of view, is sort of the place where everyone would like to hold every tournament if they could. So the assumption was that those two countries would win. But when the actual voting happened on December 10th, that's not what happened. Instead, it was Russia who won, and a few minutes later, it was Qatar who was announced as the other winner. And those two votes, the vote for 2018 and 2022, turned out to be these cataclysmic events in the history of the sport, and it was even people that night within FIFA who quietly remarked that they couldn't believe it happened and they thought the end was coming.
Interesting. Putin appeared to be directly involved, too. And I thought after all this book, we'll get through all the corruption that Russia and Qatar still hung on to their positions. Now, June 13th, they will make the decision for, I don't know, 2026 or whatever it is. And the U.S. and Morocco are the finalists, apparently. And Morocco, as you say in the book, is the 63rd largest economy. What are your thoughts on that? And is Trump's unpopularity going to have a negative impact outside of this country for the U.S. chances?
That's a great question. I think I guess we'll all know soon enough. But I do think that it is kind of remarkable that something like that is about to happen. And of course, that the vote is taking place in, of all places, Moscow. So within Russia, there will be determination whether the U.S. gets to host the World Cup. It's a pretty remarkable situation. Trump has muddied the waters a bit because he has made a public comment and a tweet or two about the World Cup that many people have interpreted as a mistake because his popularity is not necessarily so great in every part of the world, and people feel like everyone within the American bid would have preferred to have Trump keep an arm's length from the bid. But he made the public comment. FIFA, in fact, rebuked him because FIFA holds itself up as a non-government organization and hates the idea that governments would ever interfere in its business. And so FIFA sort of gently reminded the President of the United States that might be a violation of their ethics rules to have the President of the U.S. making comments about people people that sort of partners now as the U.S. should remember their friends when it's time to vote. That was considered sort of ill form. And a lot of people think that this vote, which is on June 13th, is an opportunity for the rest of the world to hold what amounts to a referendum on the popularity of the current administration.
Now, interestingly, Christopher Steele makes an appearance in this scandal, and people will know he was behind the Trump dossier that BuzzFeed released, and you're with BuzzFeed. Talk a little bit about that, and also the Trump Tower, and even some of the sleazy friends of Trump, Chuck Blazer in particular, we'll talk more about him later, appear in this scandal as well.
Well, that's right. So Christopher Steele played an absolutely central role in the story of the FIFA, what became known as the FIFA case or the FIFA investigation within the American DOJ. So Christopher Steele was a lifelong or a career MI6 agent for the UK. So he was a spy, essentially the kind of job that we imagine James Bond had. Well, he was the real McCoy. He was a Russia expert for the British Secret Service. Had at least one rotation in Russia doing underground spy stuff, I suppose. And then he later was stationed at their desk in London, and then spent time in France and other countries, and had a career as a spy, and ultimately left and started a private company that he would do research for corporations and others and law firms for a fee. And that's not uncommon for former spy operatives, CIA, MI6, people from other spy agencies around the world do that kind of thing. So he opened it up in 2009, and out of the gate, almost his first client was the English World Cup bid. So the sponsors and the corporations that were behind the bid for England to win the rights to hold the 2018 World Cup hired him and others to do research to help improve their chances of winning. And they hired him because they knew Russia was running as well to host it, and they wanted Russia. They wanted sort of the most information they could get about Russia, and so Steele was retained to gather that. And as he's gathering this information, he's discovering what he considers to be troubling things about the way Russia is running the bid, particularly under Vladimir Putin's oversight. And after a few months of gathering this kind of information, he finally decides that it's not enough just to tell the British bid. There's other people who ought to know as well. And he'd been at the same time developing a separate relationship with the FBI. The FBI had come to him for information about an illegal gambling and illegal bookmaking ring that was run mostly out of all places, the Trump Tower in Manhattan. That gambling ring was run apparently by a Russian organized crime figure, head of an organized crime family in Russia. And these FBI investigators who are specialists in Russian organized crime went to London and were introduced to Steele, and they were looking for information about the head of this Russian organized crime family. And a few months later, Chris Steele called the FBI agents back and said, "Listen, I have information about a different matter that may be of interest to you." And there is some connective tissue actually between the two, not a lot, but it turns out the head of that Russian crime family was quite the sports fan, and there are photos of him hanging out with the president of FIFA and mingling with FIFA people, and there are lots of questions about what relationship there might be. But in particular, what Chris Steele wanted to tell the FBI about was about how Russia might be, cooking the books and fixing the vote for hosting the 2018 World Cup. And whatever he told them was convincing enough that they went back to New York and rung up a prosecutor in Brooklyn, which is one of the federal districts, and said to this federal prosecutor, essentially, "We think there's a case here. What do you think about opening a FIFA case?" And the prosecutor liked the idea, and they opened the case. So it's entirely accurate to say there would be no FIFA case without Christopher Steele. Just in some ways, as perhaps there wouldn't be nearly as much fear about President Trump if not for Christopher Steele.
All right, as we're finishing this segment, look at these numbers. $300 million of bribes over 3 decades. One bribe was $100 million. An Argentine marketing executive paid $160 million in bribes. A Brazilian bribe paid $151 million. We'll get to the whodunit in the next segment. We're back with Ken Bensinger, an explosive new book, blowing the lid on the soccer scandal. It's called Red Card, How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. Let me ask you one thing. Internationally, it's often not illegal, or at least the governments look the other way, to take bribes. Interesting, too, that they used the same M.O. when he was doing the Trump dossier. He eventually said, "I got to get this to the FBI." Now, you must know of him at BuzzFeed, et cetera. My question is, I looked at the Trump dossier again, and, it has this stuff in it. Some of it's sensational. Some of it's, very specific. Does he put stuff in there that is sort of under the gossip, that he's heard stuff, along with stuff that he knows is true? Is it a mixture of that so you can't get your arms around the credibility overall?
Well, what I would say is that my experience with Christopher Steele's intelligence is it's pretty consistent in that he never has never described it as sort of actionable judicial level investigation. That is to say, it's not the kind of thing you could show to a jury and say,
right,
This is what happened. He never portrays it as that at any level. He always believes it's sort of guidance information and what he considers raw intelligence. And so it all, if you look at his intelligence on different topics, it all has a similar tone. I don't think it's written that way because it wants to be salacious. It's more like he has his own thresholds about what is and what is not intelligence, and that's not the same as a prosecutor or a journalist would have. Mm-hmm. What can be made public, right? Because it's not considered to be public. So the FIFA stuff he was gathering had to do with alleged, backroom deals and vote swaps between Russia and Qatar, mm-hmm. and the influence of FIFA voters, perhaps with gifts and other, acts of largesse towards them. It was no photograph of a guy taking a painting. There was a statement. It seems to be that or there's rumors that they are taking paintings from the Hermitage in St. Petersburg and giving Picassos and that sort of thing to FIFA voters in exchange for their promise to vote for Russia. So he didn't prove that they did it, but he'd heard it from enough sources that he felt like it was worth not noting down, And that's a good one to sort of fact check against the statements, because it later turned out that at least one and maybe two of FIFA's voters did indeed receive paintings, but one of them admitted to it, but then claimed it was an insignificant, unimportant painting and had no value. So it stood up Christopher Steele's allegation that there was artwork given out. You can bicker about whether it was a Picasso or a piece of junk, but the fact of the matter is he much earlier said that was happening, and indeed it was. And I think that's the kind of thing we saw from the Steele dossier, or we have seen so far with the Steele dossier that was published in BuzzFeed, was that a lot of it has stood up. We don't know to what degree, but we haven't seen anything explicitly disproven. So there's certainly some incredibly salacious allegations in the Steele dossier, and some of those have not been stood up, but they haven't been knocked down either. And that, to me, is very characteristic of Chris Steele's intelligence. He might be less than perfectly right in every detail, mm-hmm. but he's rarely totally wrong.
Interesting. All right, let's blow people away now with this talk. Give folks the scope of the corruption, the scale in the soccer world.
Pretty profound. The term that the prosecutors ended up using in this case was endemic. And I like that term, and I use it a lot when I think about this, because endemic it implies that it is both everywhere and it's sort of propagating itself at this sort of rate where it's everywhere and it's under every rock. And that's, I think, what it's like. I mean, FIFA's corruption extended from the highest, most important things and issues and most important characters. The longtime president of FIFA, who was from 1974 to 1998, was president of FIFA, was later caught having taken millions and millions of dollars of bribes over many years for rights to the World Cup and other things. So it sort of can't get any higher than that. And it works all the way down to sort of the lowest ranking sort of regional FIFA type official in some podunk, country somewhere around the world who are taking money some way or the other. There's almost no one within that entire pyramid, if you can think of it as a pyramid, who is untouched. And what they're taking money for as well is for everything from the most sort of, quote unquote sacred things about FIFA, like the World Cup, to sort of, piddly little minor things like, a construction project to build bathrooms on a temporary field that players can play on in a country in the Caribbean. Turns out that some soccer official might have been skimming a few $1,000s off the construction budget for his own interests. It's that kind of thing. You can't turn over a rock in the world of soccer almost anywhere without finding somebody took a little piece of it for themselves and saw the sport as an opportunity to take for themselves. And the results, in terms of blowing people away, is incredible. It's incredibly luxurious and sort of rarefied lifestyle that these people who rule soccer live. They're flown everywhere in first class. Many of them will say they haven't been in non-first class in years, and that the only thing they wouldn't even consider it, and they wouldn't fly if they couldn't go first class. They stay in five-star hotels. I mean, they're really the best hotels in the world. They're chauffeured everywhere. Every need is taken care of. Every meal is a gourmet meal provided by a chef who's all too delighted to provide the meal, free of charge, just so a FIFA top executive will eat at their restaurant. They're given exorbitant gifts. In the 2014 World Cup, every FIFA executive committee member. The executive committee is the most powerful controlling committee of FIFA, and at the time, the one that made the votes for where World Cups were held and other important issues. Everyone went into their hotel room to find a goodie bag stuffed with amazing stuff, and at the bottom of each goodie bag was a $20,000 watch.
Is that a fair thing that in this is the U.S. coming in and inserting our moral structure, our judicial structure?
It's a good question. Bribery is from a legal point of view is a more complicated and thorny subject than it is from kind of a moral point of view. I think the laws on bribery are complicated and vary from place to place, and it's definitely true that in many countries in the world, what's known as commercial bribery, which is private corporations or individuals agreeing to bribe one another, is often not explicitly illegal, as opposed to sort of what we think of public bribery, which would be a public official taking or giving bribes for some kind of benefit. But that rule also extends to the U.S. There is no federal commercial bribery statute in the U.S. There are some states with commercial bribery statutes. New York State comes to mind, Utah, a few others I know of that have it, but it's not the rule. And so what the prosecutors in this case have argued is it's a bit specious to say, bribery is perfectly allowable in our country, and therefore, this investigation is founded on something that's imposing American law in our country. Because I think, and I say this with a slight tone of admiration because I think it's awful clever, what the prosecutors figured out how to do was really smart, and to get around that whole issue, if you really splice the issue, which is then ultimately, the crimes were the misdeeds were bribery. The crimes that they're focusing on, in fact, are not bribery in the case, but what they considered species of fraud. What they're essentially saying is that these people committed different kinds of fraud en route to taking money for things they shouldn't have taken, because in almost every instance, these are officers of different soccer organizations around the world that all have their own ethics code. And the ethics codes all explicitly prohibit taking or receiving bribes. And when these officials secretly take bribes, they are effectively defrauding their organization of the money that should have been theirs, or defrauding the organization of officers who honor the ethics code they've signed. And so what the government did is they charged them with a bunch of frauds, which are pretty hard to deny because they pretty clearly show how they signed the ethics code, and there was an ethics code and they were aware of it, and they did these things anyway, and lied to their organization about what they did, and defrauded them because it cost the organization money. It's sort of tantamount in the sense of stealing money from the corporation or the organization you work for. So that's what they got him on, and they also got him on money laundering, which is a cleaner and easier thing to do. But money laundering has to have what's called a predicate crime or a pre-existing crime to make it a crime. That is to say, you're allowed to put money anywhere you want around the world. It's clean. You can do anything with it. You can send it through Aruba all the way to Hong Kong, back again, and then into a car wash, and then spit it out as cash and put it in a different account and send it in the world again. That's perfectly fine. But if any of that money was acquired illegally, then all that cleaning is a problem. And what the different soccer officials did is very clearly launder the money they were getting as bribes, and do all those tricks with it to send to different bank accounts to clean it up. And so the prosecutors charge them for that as well.
We'll get to the whodunit in the next segment. We're back with Ken Bensinger, an explosive new book, blowing the lid on the soccer scandal. It's called Red Card, How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. We're going to look at some of the players now, the bad guys and the good guys. First, you got to talk about this Chuck Blazer guy, and he's scary looking in the pictures in the book. But go ahead.
Yeah, so Chuck Blazer is an amazing, unforgettable figure in this whole thing. And if he sort of, in a weird twist of fate, if he had lived anywhere but the U.S., he might have been a much more known international figure, at least in the soccer world. He's a guy who came up having never played soccer, but then as a parent, as your sort of prototypical soccer dad, came up through the suburban soccer ranks of outside of New York City until he scaled almost pretty much the highest heights of the entire sport. He was briefly a vice president of the United States Soccer Federation. And then by 1990, he'd become general secretary, which is the number 2 position at CONCACAF. And CONCACAF is one of 6 regional confederations that control all soccer in the world. CONCACAF oversees North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. So that includes the U.S., Canada, Mexico, and every island in the Caribbean, plus all the way down to Panama and Costa Rica in Central America, and then 2 little blips in South America, the Guyana and Suriname are also part of it. Blazer was the general secretary of that, and starting in 1997, I believe, he became a member of FIFA's executive committee as well. So he was the highest ranking and most powerful American in world soccer, probably ever, certainly for many, many, many years. Within that capacity, he did some incredible things for the sport, and that's what makes him an interesting character. Is it's the guy who was a huge supporter of the women's game, who helped the United States women's national team be formed in the mid-1980s, and who played a big role in creating the Women's World Cup. He also helped MLS, the professional league in the U.S., get a TV contract that was actually sort of net positive, that they actually, if you can believe it, they used to pay to be on TV, and Chuck Blazer helped them get a contract where they got paid to be on TV. And so there's all these things that are in his legacy that are positive, but it turns out the entire time that he's doing these things, he's skimming millions and millions of dollars from the sport. And the fact that someone could do that without any scrutiny for so long, and who also happens to be, as you described, quite an unusual-looking person. He was grossly overweight. He weighed about 450 pounds, sometimes as much as 500 pounds. Had a giant frizzy white beard, big curly gray locks, thick black eyebrows, and if anyone ever takes the time to Google him, you'll see that he loved to dress up in fancy costumes and parade around, as a pirate or as a character from Star Wars or things like that. So really, just kind of an unbelievable character, but he was almost anonymous because soccer is just not that big of a deal in the U.S. compared to the rest of the world. And so while his buddies in the FIFA Executive Committee, or EXCO as it's known, are scrutinized by the press everywhere they go their entire life, Chuck Blazer could walk around, or in his case, wheel around, because he often used a scooter, wheel around Central Park with his pet parrot. And I'm not kidding, he would wheel around Central Park on his mobility scooter with his pet parrot perched on his shoulder, and no one would even notice. And he
lived in the Trump Tower.
What's that?
And he lived in the Trump Tower, yeah.
Who lived in the Trump Tower and had his rent paid for by soccer, not by him, was one of the most influential soccer guys in the world. And, yeah, he was a buddy of Donald Trump. He rented from Donald Trump all the way back to 1990 at a time when the economy was pretty bad. There was a recession going on at the time, and Trump was desperate to fill the tower and offered Chuck Blazer a great deal. I think it was like a 10 or 11-year lease on office space and ultimately apartments as well for Blazer within the Trump Tower at a very reduced rate. And they hit it off and were friends for years. And one story about Donald Trump and Chuck Blazer is that when Chuck Blazer had his 40th or 50th high school reunion, he grew up in Queens, New York, and so wasn't that far from New York, or from Manhattan, excuse me. Trump offered to let Blazer use the atrium of the Trump Tower to host the party for free, and so Blazer had his high school reunion in the Trump Tower, courteous of Donald Trump.
What amazed me is that here's this guy who found a way to steal all this money, didn't even file taxes, which seems like a pretty, crazy thing to do. Tell us now, let's do a guy that was on the other side paying the bribes, Ho Willa.
Yeah. So Jose Ho Willa, or Jose Avila, as they say in Brazil, is a really interesting character as well. A brilliant guy, a visionary, and a pioneer, and did really a great deal to change the sport, but hopelessly corrupt as well. He was a former sports journalist. As a kid who grew up in soccer crazy Brazil, loved the sport, and all he ever wanted to do was to be a soccer player. But when it turned out he wasn't good enough, he decided to be a soccer journalist. And so he would, back in the 60s, go to soccer matches and do the play-by-play on the radio and be on the sidelines, as a sideline reporter, that sort of thing. And then he developed into a TV reporter and ultimately an important sort of TV anchor. And around early 1980s, he grew tired of that, wanted to try something else, and got into advertising. And he bought a company that did billboard advertising and bus stop advertising, that sort of thing, and thought that advertising company could get into soccer. And so he got into stadium advertising and started buying and selling the space in stadiums where you could put ads at soccer matches, which we now see everywhere. At the time, that was brand new. They didn't have that kind of advertising. Made a little bit of money there, and then thought, there's a business in the rights for soccer. That is to say, the right to broadcast to TV, because the organizations, FIFA and down, aren't TV broadcasters. They don't have the know-how or the contacts or the sales teams to do TV themselves. All they have is the right, and they can sell us the right, and then we can do all that. And so, and the same goes for sponsorship. He realized that he could buy the rights to sell sponsorships to major soccer tournaments, right? And so it could be the World Cup brought to you by Adidas or Coca-Cola. He didn't own that particular deal, but there was someone who did. He figured out that he could sell the rights to major South American tournaments and make a big profit. And he started buying up those rights in the mid-1980s, but it only took about 2 or 3 years of doing that until corruption crept in, and all these soccer administrators, these men who ran these organizations, were demanding bribes in exchange for their John Hancocks on the contracts. And he started paying a little bit of money, and then it got real big real fast. And starting in about 88 or 89, all the way through 2013, he was doling out millions of dollars of bribes every single year to a kind of an alarming array of officials throughout South America in exchange for the rights that were his lifeblood of his business. But his business, which is called Traffic, was enormously successful, and they opened offices all over the place, including in Miami, where they had a big operation, where they played a big role in certain categories of U.S. soccer rights, American soccer rights, and he became enormously wealthy, by some accounts worth about $500 million, this guy Avila, and with a fleet of luxury cars and luxury homes and beach houses. And actually, one of the very last transactions he did before he fell under the net of the Department of Justice was to buy a $6 million condo on Fisher Island in Miami, which is this man-made island in the harbor of Miami, or in the Gulf, in the Biscayne Bay in Miami. It is the most expensive zip code in the entire United States of America. And Avila bought a $6 million condo there. And just a few days after he signed the papers, he was picked up and arrested in his hotel in Miami. And they had caught him thanks to the help of Chuck Blazer, which is a bit of a spoiler perhaps, but they got him and made him a cooperator in the investigation.
Now, the good guys, the IRS worked with the Eastern District of New York U.S. Attorney and the FBI, and Steve Berman is a special agent for the IRS, was the key guy.
Yeah, and I have a special place in my heart for Steve Berman. Really, another unlikely but terrific character in this saga. Steve Berman is a lifelong IRS agent, and talking to people within the service, they say that he's one of the handful of best, if not the best, agent working in the country today. An incredibly diligent, thorough, creative, and hardworking agent who just is relentless and doesn't stop working and doesn't stop in a case until he's figured it out, and who sees these kinds of financial cases as riddles to be solved, sort of giant jigsaw puzzles. And Berman also has a special connection to soccer, which is that he was a prototypical Army brat. His father, I think, was in the Air Force and was stationed for many years in England. And as a result, Steve Berman, who appears as American as apple pie, spent much of his youth in England, where he developed a passion for soccer. He ends up moving back to the States, grows up and spends most of his time in California, currently lives south of LA and works in Orange County, California, but loves soccer and is a devoted fan of Liverpool, the English club, gets up early every weekend morning to watch the matches in real time in Europe, and almost by accident stumbles across the opportunity to get involved in the FIFA case, which is that he learns that there's a case out there. He doesn't know if it's going anywhere, but sees that Chuck Blazer's involved. Because he's an IRS agent, he has authority over tax issues. And when he does a few very simple searches to see if he can find anything about Chuck Blazer's tax situation, he discovers, lo and behold, as you mentioned earlier, that Chuck Blazer doesn't bother paying taxes. And when they find that out, they see an easy mark. And within a few months, they're face-to-face with Chuck Blazer in the atrium next door to Trump Tower, telling him that he has two choices, their way or the highway. And Blazer immediately agrees to cooperate with the investigation.
Now, was Berman the guy that figured out they should go after this using the RICO statutes like it's a mob deal?
Yeah, that's right. But it's curious. Some of the prosecutors involved in the case had done RICO cases throughout their whole career, but they weren't really sure at that stage whether this was a RICO case or not. They just, I think, had a real difficult time wrapping their heads around what FIFA was and how it worked. And it was Berman who, curiously, although he'd done many cases throughout his career, had never done a RICO case, looked at it and went to them and said, "This is RICO." I think the way to understand FIFA, the way to understand all these organizations is as a highly structured, organized crime situation where there is a power structure and that everything radiates down from that, and that the actions of the lowest soldiers, if you will, in the organization reflect sort of the DNA of the organization as a whole. They all work in some respects for a common goal. And it's a very special criminal statute, very powerful one because it has very severe penalties, and also because people can essentially be implicated and punished for crimes that they didn't directly commit, but that were committed because of the sort of the auspices, under the auspices of the organization in which they are a member. And he said, this is the way to get them. When we're dealing with something this corrupt and this large and this sweeping, the only way to really do it is to think of it that way. And the prosecutors agreed, and when the investigation finally went public, the soccer world was shocked because you had top American law enforcement officials referring to FIFA as organized crime.
And this key, which I found interesting, was laundering through, I guess, correspondent banking, because a lot of these were small island countries and stuff, right? And he was able to find, like, if you made one deposit at Merrill Lynch, it would open the whole door?
Yeah, what he found, that's right. So what he was brilliant at, in that piece of it, was understanding how to trace money from place to place and how to, en route to claim U.S. jurisdiction for the case. One of the concerns of the prosecutors throughout was, are we going to be able to effectively convince the jury that this is an American issue, that this touches our soil? Because as much as they could demonstrate that bribes were being paid, that organizations were being defrauded, that money was being laundered, they still have to prove that this affects the U.S. And the best way to do that, or if this is sort of relevant to U.S. criminal jurisprudence, and the best way to do that is to show that there's actual physical, jurisdiction.
Back for our final segment on the soccer scandal that shook the world. Final segment, Ken Bensinger on blowing the whistle on the biggest scandal in sports history. Tell folks the short version of the actual takedown. And at Bowerlock Hotel, I've been there. It's really nice. My dad used to be an insurance executive. He stayed there.
Wow. Jealous of your dad. I've been in the lobby a couple times, but I've never slept there. Varlock is by most measures Switzerland's fanciest hotel in its most expensive city, Zurich, and it's got nice views of Lake Zurich, and it's a very nice hotel and a very Swiss style, which is there's something of a understated kind of elegance that the Swiss are experts at, where they don't. It's not one of these hotels with these massive lobbies that you could fit, a jumbo jet in. It's actually rather a discreet lobby, but everything is sort of perfect and beautiful and gorgeous when you look at it, and that's the Swiss way, I think. And early on the morning of May 27th, 2015, around 6 a.m., when all FIFA's executives who stayed there for a big meeting were asleep in their rooms, a detachment of Swiss plainclothes police walked into the bar lock, announced themselves to the front desk, and then began methodically walking from room to room, knocking on doors and arresting FIFA officials. And the FIFA investigation, which at that point was almost 5 years old, was suddenly public. They were announcing to the world what was going on, which is that they had been looking into the crimes of these people for years and were ready finally to strike. And this whole operation at the bar lock was at the behest of the U.S. Justice Department, which over months had coordinated with the Swiss law enforcement to do that. The news struck like a bolt of lightning, and the entire world went crazy. It was a slower news era back then, as I'm sure you'll remember. 2015 wasn't like today, where every day feels like another news explosion. So this particular story absolutely dominated headlines for days and days and days, if not weeks. The big news was that the U.S. was investigating corruption in soccer, and it was arresting people in this holy shrine to soccer, the bar lock, where all the fancy FIFA executives get to stay. In this case, they were in town for a few days later, a vote to re-elect Sepp Blatter again. And so it was really something that no one who loved the sport could believe would ever happen, but there had happened in the most public way possible. And all these people got arrested, and then most of them got extradited. Months later, there was another indictment that went out, and more arrests, shockingly, in the exact same hotel. You would think people would learn, but no, they stayed in the same hotel and got arrested again. And it was sort of the coming out for this entire case.
Do you think that only the U.S. could have prosecuted this case, in part because there's much less interest in soccer here?
I think it has to have played a role. I think that this sport in most countries is intrinsically political and sort of intertwined with politics to such a degree that it's almost impossible to disconnect them. And politicians tend to be very gun shy when it comes to going after things that the public really loves. And we've seen other countries sort of take a swing at FIFA in the past, and it's really half-hearted at best. The Brits have expressed public outrage many times over some of the very clear excesses and corruptions of FIFA, but seem to always stop short of actually doing anything beyond a few sort of congressional or judicial, parliamentary committees where they'll make a lot of noise but never do anything. The Swiss did the only previous real investigation, but because of the curious nature of Swiss law, the people who were implicated in the bribery were allowed to pay civil penalties and walk away scot-free and keep the entire case anonymous. The U.S. soccer is a fourth, fifth, somewhere in there, most popular sport. People don't pull their hair out at the national level about the outcome of soccer matches, and that gave the investigators the kind of cover they needed to run the investigation without interference. And I do think that's almost unique. I mean, there's a few other countries that would do it, but there aren't many. So you need the combination of a country with strong fraud laws, strong money laundering laws, a will to fight those kind of cases, and the political cover or the lack of interest in the topic that would allow them to do this without interference.
Do you think the sport is clean now, or is this like ISIS? It just regenerates with different sleazy guys?
Well, I guess if we're like ISIS, they would have had to find a different statute. Maybe it could have, if they could run this as a terrorism case, that would have been really something. I think that soccer is not clean now, unfortunately. I think that this is one of those things, kind of like organized crime, and I mentioned this briefly in my book, but one of the things about organized crime is when you knock off one head of an organized crime family, by the time you prosecute him and put him in jail with another head of the same family, and he knocks that one off, and then another one comes up. It's very hard to eradicate the entire organization. And I think that my sense is that they may have knocked off some of the worst ones, but there's every indication there's plenty of other people who still consider soccer corruption almost their birthright. People who've come up in the sport who believe that they have a right to take this money, and they're not going to let some U.S. investigation get in their way. A source of mine in South America said that as soon as the U.S. did this case and claimed jurisdiction for, among other things, the fact that almost all the bribes were paid in dollars, well, all the South American soccer officials just simply started taking euros instead of dollars. And they figured that would protect them. But to me, that was indicative of the way things are.
What's the status of the DOJ investigation? Is it still ongoing?
It's still ongoing. It's been a long time, so some of the people that were involved in the case at the beginning have cycled out of it, but some of them are still there, including Steve Berman, who's still in the case. And there's still interesting threads, including some connective tissue that's leading them to other parts of the world. So they've gone after North and South America. There's every indication that they might go after Asia and the Middle East as well. So this is a thing that could have legs for many years to come.
Do you think, as we finish up, that soccer's popularity or credibility has been hit or not?
Oh, I think there's no question that the credibility of the sport has been hit. I mean, look no further than the World Cup happening now in Russia, of all places. I mean, the idea that this tournament is being held in Russia, a country that we've now, with very little doubt determined meddles in the political affairs of other countries and messes with their elections, and it's not just limited to the U.S., but countries all over the world, would be hosting this event that's supposed to be a prestige, event that's supposed to make a country look good. I think it's hard not to think that it doesn't cheapen or undercut the value of the event and makes it look like they really just will sell the sport to the highest bidder, and they don't really care what it looks like.
Well, the book is an amazing story. It's hard to believe that it's all actually true. Thanks to Ken Bensinger. It was a fast hour. The book is Red Card, How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. This has been Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. You can get podcasts available, commercial-free version at YouTube. Search Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell or Park City Productions 06604. Thanks again to Ken Bensinger, the author of Red Card. And thanks to our audience. We'll see everybody next Monday evening for another edition of Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.